The estate had been quiet for years, the kind of quiet that settles deep into the walls and lingers in the air. When I inherited it, winter had already claimed the land. Snow covered the long driveway in soft, unbroken layers, and the iron gates stood half-frozen, as if even they weren't used to being opened anymore. I remember unlocking them slowly, feeling the weight of history more than the cold in my hands. This place wasn't just property. It was memory, legacy, and responsibility rolled into one. The house itself sat back from the road, wrapped in tall pines and trimmed hedges that had once been meticulously maintained. The previous owner, an older relative who valued privacy more than popularity, had never bothered with the surrounding HOA politics. He paid dues when required, ignored the rest, and lived peacefully. Or so I thought. I'd only been there a few weeks when December arrived in full force. Lights began appearing in neighboring homes, wreaths on doors, inflatable decorations lining the streets. The estate, however, remained understated. A few warm lights along the driveway, a simple wreath on the door, and that was it. I wasn't trying to make a statement. I was just settling in. Then came the invitations. Friends, colleagues, a handful of longtime acquaintances. Nothing wild. A Christmas gathering, modest by estate standards but lively enough to bring warmth back into the house. Music, food, laughter. The kind of night meant to remind people they weren't alone in winter. I didn't think twice about it. That was my first mistake. The HOA had noticed the estate again. It started with a letter slipped into my mailbox and signed but printed on official letterhead. It mentioned event concerns and community standards with vague language about noise, parking, and approval requirements. No greeting, no name, just expectations. I read it once, folded it, and set it aside. The party wasn't violating anything. I'd checked. The second notice came by email, sharper in tone. It referenced unauthorized gatherings and suggested I reconsider hosting large-scale functions without HOA coordination. I replied politely, attaching the relevant sections of the bylaws. According to their own rules, I was well within my rights. There was no response. By the time Christmas Eve arrived, snow had fallen again, and the estate glowed softly against the dark woods. Cars lined the driveway neatly, lights twinkled through the windows, and music drifted gently into the night. Inside, people laughed, glasses clinked, and for the first time since inheriting the place, it felt alive. That's when the phone buzzed. I ignored it at first. Then it buzzed again. And again. A guest near the window went quiet. "There are police cars outside," she said. The room froze, not in panic, but confusion. I stepped outside, coat thrown over my shoulders, breath fogging the air. 2 patrol cars sat just beyond the gate, lights flashing softly against the snow. An HOA representative stood nearby, arms folded tightly, posture rigid with satisfaction. She didn't look at me at first. She was too busy explaining to the officers that an illegal event was taking place, that the estate was being used improperly, that residents had complained. That action was necessary. When she finally turned, her expression wasn't anger. It was certainty. Certainty that she was in control. Certainty that this would end the way she wanted. She had no idea who she'd just called the police on. And she certainly didn't know what kind of night this was about to become. The officers approached calmly, boots crunching against the snow as they stopped a few feet from the gate. Their expressions were neutral, professional, the kind that said they'd been called into plenty of disputes like this before. Loud neighbors, parking complaints, holiday noise, routine. The woman from the HOA stood slightly behind them now, chin lifted, arms still crossed, already convinced she'd won. She spoke before anyone asked her to. She always did. She explained that the estate was part of a regulated community, that gatherings of this size required prior approval, and that multiple residents had reported excessive noise and unauthorized parking. She used words like disturbance and liability, tossing them out confidently, as if volume alone made them true. Every sentence ended with the same implication: remove the problem. I waited. One of the officers finally turned to me and asked if I was the homeowner. I nodded and told him yes, the property had recently been inherited, and yes, I was hosting a private Christmas party. No amplification outside. No blocked roads. No violations. The HOA representative scoffed quietly. That's not what our rules say, she interjected, already reaching into her folder. I recognized the move immediately. This wasn't about enforcement. It was about dominance. About reminding someone new that they were being watched and corrected. The officer accepted the papers she handed over, scanned them briefly, then asked if I had documentation of my own. I did. I always did. Copies of the deed. HOA bylaws with highlighted sections. Permits for the estate that predated half the surrounding homes. As I handed the folder over, her confidence faltered just a fraction. Barely noticeable, but it was there. The officers stepped aside to review everything together. The silence stretched. Snow fell lightly. Music continued inside, muted but steady, as if the house itself refused to acknowledge the interruption. She leaned closer to me, lowering her voice. This isn't how things are done here, she said. You can't just host events without clearing it, especially on Christmas. I looked at her and realized something important. She truly believed the rules were hers. That authority lived in her tone, her posture, her certainty. She'd never considered that someone might understand the system better than she did, or that the system might not bend to her will. I told her calmly that everything was compliant and that the party would continue. That was all.
She didn't like that.
Her voice rose just enough for the officers to hear. She insisted they shut it down before it escalated. She suggested fines. She mentioned future consequences. She even hinted that I'd regret starting off on the wrong foot. The officers returned. One of them addressed me directly. He said, based on the documents, there was no immediate violation. Noise levels were acceptable. Parking was contained on private property. There was no legal basis to disperse the gathering. The woman's face tightened. That can't be right, she said sharply. This estate has always followed HOA oversight. The officer replied evenly, Ma'am, ownership has changed. And the bylaws you provided don't grant authority in this situation. That was the moment the power shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, just a subtle tilt of the balance she'd been standing on. She tried to recover, insisting that she'd escalate the issue, contact higher authorities, and ensure this was dealt with properly. The officer nodded, uninterested in threats. Then he asked me a question that changed the air entirely. Sir, he said, glancing at the paperwork again, is the address listed here also your official residence? I answered honestly. Yes, it was. He paused, then asked one more thing, something she wasn't prepared to hear. And are you the same individual listed in our municipal directory? I met his eyes and nodded. Her certainty cracked. Not all at once. Not publicly. But enough. Enough for her to realize this wasn't a simple neighbor dispute anymore. Enough for the officers to look at her differently. Enough for the night to take a turn she hadn't planned for. And Christmas had only just begun. The shift was subtle, but once it happened, there was no undoing it. The officers didn't change their tone dramatically. They didn't step back or stiffen up. What changed was their attention. Where it had been evenly split between both sides, it now settled, quietly, decisively on me. The paperwork in their hands suddenly carried more weight than the accusations floating in the cold air. The HOA representative noticed it too. She straightened, forcing a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. I'm sure there's been some confusion, she said quickly, trying to smooth the edges she'd just sharpened. This neighborhood has procedures, and sometimes new owners aren't fully informed. One of the officers closed the folder. There's no confusion, he said. Everything checks out. Her smile faltered. She tried a different angle. She talked about community harmony, about tradition, about how things had always been done. She implied that allowing the party to continue would set a dangerous precedent. Her words came faster now, less controlled, as if urgency might restore the authority she felt slipping away. I said nothing. Inside the house, laughter swelled, someone starting a familiar Christmas song. The contrast was almost surreal. Warmth and joy just a few steps away, tension and ego freezing on the driveway. The second officer cleared his throat and asked the question she'd been dreading. "Ma'am, what is your role with the HOA?" She answered immediately. "Board member. Long-standing. Influential." The kind of title she expected to end the discussion. Instead, the officer nodded once and replied, "That doesn't give you enforcement authority beyond what's written." Her jaw tightened. "Then who does?" she snapped, before catching herself. The officer glanced at me again. "In this case, no one. Not tonight." That should have been the end of it. But she wasn't finished. She took a step closer to the gate and lowered her voice, aiming it directly at me. "You might have connections," she said, thinly veiled accusations slipping through. "But this community doesn't appreciate surprises. Especially from people who think they're above the rules." That's when I finally spoke, not to defend myself, not to threaten, but to clarify. I told her I respected the neighborhood, that I'd followed the rules as written, that this was a private gathering on private property, and that escalating a non-issue on Christmas Eve was a choice she'd made, not me. She scoffed, but it sounded hollow. One of the officers received a message over his radio. He listened, nodded, and turned back to us. His posture shifted just slightly, formal now. Deliberate. "Sir," he said to me, "dispatch confirms your status." The words hung in the air longer than they needed to. Her eyes widened, just a fraction. "Status," she repeated. The officer didn't answer her. He didn't need to. He addressed me again, using my title this time. Respectful. Official. The way he would address someone whose authority didn't come from a clipboard or a committee. That was the moment she understood. Not the full picture. Not yet, but enough to realize she'd miscalculated. This wasn't a homeowner she could intimidate. This wasn't a newcomer who needed to be put in their place. This was someone embedded in the very system she'd tried to manipulate. Her confidence collapsed inward. She stopped speaking altogether, lips pressed tight, eyes darting between the officers and the house behind me. The officers informed her, calmly and clearly, that the party would continue, that there was no violation, and that further misuse of emergency services could carry consequences. They wished me a Merry Christmas. When they left, the driveway fell silent again. Snow continued to fall, soft and indifferent. The gate remained open. She stood there for a moment longer, staring at the estate as if seeing it for the first time, not as something she controlled, but as something far beyond her reach. And for the first time that night, she said nothing at all. The aftermath didn't explode the way she probably expected it to. There was no shouting match, no dramatic exit, no last attempt to reclaim control. Instead, there was something far worse for someone like her: silence. The kind that follows when a plan collapses so completely, there's nothing left to argue. She lingered for a few seconds after the patrol cars disappeared, standing just inside the gate as if waiting for permission that was never going to come. Then she turned and walked back toward the road, heels crunching against the snow, shoulders stiff with contained humiliation. Not once did she look back. Inside the house, the party resumed almost immediately. Music swelled, conversations picked up where they'd paused, and laughter returned like it had never left. A few guests asked quietly if everything was okay. I told them yes. That was the truth. It was more than okay, it was settled. But the real consequences didn't arrive that night. They came in the days that followed. The first sign was an email from the HOA board, noticeably more polite than the earlier messages. It referenced a misunderstanding on Christmas Eve and assured me that no further action would be taken regarding the gathering. No apology, just retreat. The second message arrived the next day, clarifying that future communications should go through official channels and reminding residents not to contact emergency services for non-emergencies. Her name wasn't mentioned once. Then came the quiet adjustments. A scheduled compliance walk for the estate was canceled. A proposed amendment regarding event approvals disappeared from the agenda. The tone of every interaction shifted from authority to caution, like a group suddenly aware they were standing closer to the edge than they realized. Word traveled quickly, though no one admitted it. Neighbors waved more carefully. Conversations softened. A few people even stopped by, not to complain, but to introduce themselves properly for the first time. They didn't mention the police. They didn't mention Christmas. But they didn't need to. I didn't use my position. I didn't make calls. I didn't demand accountability. I didn't have to. The system corrected itself the moment it realized it had been misused. And misuse always leaves a trace. A week later, I saw her again. She was at the edge of the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, speaking to another board member. Her posture was different now, less rigid, less commanding. When she noticed me, she paused, hesitated, then offered a tight smile.
Polite. Careful.
I returned the gesture and kept walking. That was the end of it. No revenge. No victory lap. Just boundaries firmly reestablished. The estate returned to its quiet rhythm, snow melting slowly as the year turned. The house held on to the warmth of that Christmas night, not as a memory of conflict, but as proof that it belonged to me, fully, undeniably. What stayed with me wasn't her embarrassment or the board's retreat. It was the clarity of the moment she realized authority isn't something you claim. It's something that exists whether you announce it or not. She had relied on intimidation, assumptions, and the expectation that no one would challenge her version of the rules. She was wrong. The irony was unavoidable. She'd called the police to shut down a Christmas party, convinced she was defending order. Instead, she exposed her own overreach in the most public, documented way possible. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back to how things were before. The estate didn't change after that night. It simply became what it had always been meant to be, a place beyond petty control, grounded in patience and protected by truth rather than noise. And she learned the hardest lesson of all. Some doors don't close loudly. They just stop opening. By the time spring arrived, the estate felt different, not because anything had changed, but because nothing needed to. Snow retreated from the driveway, the pines shed their winter silence, and the house settled back into the steady rhythm it had known long before anyone thought to challenge it. The events of Christmas faded into memory, but the lesson they carried remained, quietly embedded in the way people moved around the place now. No one questioned the gates anymore. The HOA correspondence became procedural and distant, stripped of tone and assumption. Notices were addressed correctly. Language softened. Requests replaced demands. It was remarkable how quickly certainty disappears once it's tested against reality. Authority, when real, doesn't need reminders. And once false authority is exposed, it never fully recovers. I hosted another gathering in late March. Smaller. Quieter. Nothing festive, just neighbors, food, and conversation. No notices arrived beforehand. No emails followed. People parked neatly, laughed freely, and left without incident. That was the clearest confirmation of all. The issue had never been noise or rules. It had been control. Occasionally, I thought about how close she'd come to making that night something else entirely. A confrontation. A spectacle. A story fueled by raised voices and bruised egos. But she hadn't been prepared for restraint. She hadn't accounted for patience or paperwork or the possibility that the person she targeted didn't need to prove anything. That's what stayed with me most. Power doesn't reveal itself in moments of comfort. It reveals itself when someone tries to take something that was never theirs to begin with. She believed she could summon authority like a tool and aim it where she pleased. What she learned instead was that authority isn't summoned, it's recognized. I never told anyone who I was.
I didn't need to.
The officers already knew. The system already knew. And once that information existed, it moved on its own, correcting assumptions and recalibrating behavior without a single demand from me. That's how it's supposed to work. The estate became quieter again as summer approached. Evenings stretched longer. Light filtered through open windows. The house breathed. And every so often, I'd think about my relative, the one who'd owned this place before me, and understand him a little better. His distance from HOA politics hadn't been indifference. It had been foresight. He understood that not every challenge deserves a response. Some only need time and truth. I saw her once more near the end of the year, passing by in her car as I walked the property line. She slowed slightly, nodded once, and continued on. No clipboard. No posture of command. Just another resident moving through space she no longer tried to manage. That was the real ending. Not humiliation. Not punishment. Just adjustment. The estate didn't need defending anymore. It stood on its own, anchored by documents, by history, and by the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly where you belong. Christmas came again, lights went up, and laughter returned, but this time without interruption. If there was a lesson in all of it, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about restraint, about understanding that the loudest voice in the room often belongs to the person least secure in their position, and that sometimes the most decisive move is doing nothing at all. She tried to use the law as a weapon. Instead, it revealed the truth. And once the truth is known, it doesn't need defending. It simply remains.